You guys all know that the JJRA made a number of changes that are going to impact the way that we do compliance monitoring. And we've already been talking about some of them. The one that we have not talked about much yet is this issue of an adequate system of compliance monitoring versus an effective system of compliance monitoring. So for those of you who are familiar with the language that was in the 2002 reauthorization, okay, if you've been paying attention for the last however many years that's been, a long time, you know that Section 223A.14 of the 2002 Act said that you all must provide for an adequate system of monitoring jails, detention facilities, correctional facilities, and non-secure facilities to ensure that the core requirements are met. That's the requirements of paragraphs 11, 12, and 13, DSO separation and jail removal, to ensure that they have been met. So this was the existing standard. But with the JJRA, we had a couple of changes, right? So you'll see, if you turn to, hold on, I'll tell you, page 52 of your red line version of the Act, that's the one that I like to use because it makes clear what's changed. So that the document that has that red cover, turn to page 52. This is section 223A.14. And this is going to show you exactly where this language changed. So there are a number of more minor changes. There's one that we've already talked about, right, quite a bit on the compliance monitoring conference calls, and that's this issue of whether or not you are required to include non-secure facilities in your monitoring universes anymore. And we told you that the JJRA, you'll see here on this page, the red line version, there's a strikeout through the word non-secure facilities. That means that per the JJRA, you no longer need to have non-secure facilities in your monitoring universes. We're not going to spend much time talking about that right now because I think we've already talked about it quite a bit, but just wanted to mention that because that was another important change that was made in this section. But more importantly right now, you see it also X's out that word adequate and it says effective instead. So what the heck is the difference between an effective system for compliance monitoring and an adequate system for compliance monitoring? So let's talk a little bit first about how we historically have defined adequate. So if you look in the definition section of the 2002 Act, there is no definition for the word adequate. Okay, it doesn't appear there. And that's also true for the word effective. If you look at the definition section of the JJRA, there is also not a definition for the word effective. So that has given us some latitude. So back in 2002, we determined that we were going to define adequate in terms of 10 elements that for you to have an adequate system of compliance monitoring, you were going to need to have these 10 elements that are up on the screen right now. And hopefully this is not news to anyone that's in the room unless you're brand new. And these elements were policies and procedures. You need to tell us what your policies and procedures are for compliance monitoring in your state. You need to have monitoring authority. That means there needs to be something in your state law that says that you're allowed to go out and visit facilities that are in the monitoring universe and collect data from them and all of that. You need to have a monitoring timetable that would talk about what your time frames are for accomplishing all of these 10 elements. You need to have violation procedures. I think that's fairly self-explanatory. You need to have procedures in place for when there are violations of the core requirements, when you encounter those. You need to identify what your barriers are to achieving compliance in your state and what some strategies are to address those barriers. You need to have definitions for key monitoring terms in your state law, and you hopefully have figured out how those comport with the Act. You've identified all of the appropriate facility types in your monitoring universe. You've classified those. You are regularly inspecting those, and you're collecting data from them, and you are verifying that data. So those are the 10 elements. So I bring this up because when we've had a few preliminary conversations with you all about this whole adequate versus effective discussion, I've heard a lot of people, throwing stuff out there like, oh, well, if we're going to be talking about an effective monitoring system now, does that mean that we can just, throw out all this crazy detain confined stuff, for example, or change the definition, the way that you all define the term residential, or a whole variety of other things, which we don't necessarily think are horrible ideas, or might not necessarily disagree with you about, but I just want to make clear that we have to establish some boundaries here. So this whole issue of what constitutes an effective monitoring system does not sort of open the door for us to talk about anything and everything that's within the realm of compliance monitoring. Okay, this is about how you all, accomplish your jobs as compliance monitors. It's not about how OJJDP defines what constitutes a violation, for example. It's about how you all do monitoring in your state. So when we're looking at the difference between what's an adequate system of monitoring and what's an effective system of monitoring, I want you to focus in on what is sort of encompassed within these 10 elements that I've just talked about here. So we at OJJDP have already had some preliminary discussions about this issue. If you were on the last conference call with us that we had about a month ago, then you will have heard some of this discussion. We were in the process of developing the FY20, the draft FY20 solicitation for the Title II program, which is not on the street yet, but we're hoping that it will be very shortly. And one of the things, or two of the things that we're looking at doing with this solicitation is actually eliminating two of these elements that I just talked about a few minutes ago. So why are we doing this? We're talking about moving from adequate to effective, which should be a strengthening, right? But one of the discussions that we've had internally is that looking at a more effective system for compliance monitoring, we think also means making things more efficient. And through some of the conversations that we had about this issue, we sort of came to a consensus that some of these elements that are in here are really pretty bureaucratic, right? I mean, you all already know that you have to identify your monitoring universe, that it's something you need to do on an annual basis. That's encompassed within that identification element. You already know that you need to collect data from your facilities and that you need to do that also on an annual basis, right? That's accomplished within the data collection and data verification element. So we really felt like it was sort of redundant, I guess, and again, maybe a little bit bureaucratic to tell us that you have to actually write up a timetable for this every year and turn it into OJJDP so that we can look at it and give our official seal of approval. So this is why we have made the decision that with the FY20 solicitation that will be coming out, we are moving from 10 elements of a adequate system for compliance monitoring to 8 elements of an effective compliance monitoring system. So this does not mean, let me just say, that if you have a compliance monitoring timetable already in your policies and procedures manual, that you need to ball it up and throw it away. This does not mean that you should not be still talking with your SAGs every year, for example, about what your compliance monitoring barriers are and what your strategies might be for addressing those barriers. We are most definitely not saying that either. We are just saying that you all are not going to need to provide that information to OJJDP anymore. We trust that you know how to do that and that you're going to be doing that on your own without us looking over your collective shoulders. So that's essentially what that is about. So now let's move on and talk a little bit more about strengthening, because if you look at the dictionary definition of adequate and you look at the dictionary definition of effective, it really does sort of apply a little bit of a strengthening there, that the system is getting stronger rather than weaker, right? So we again had some internal discussions about this. And we felt as though out of all those 10 elements that I just talked about a few minutes ago, the one that was really ripe for some changes and some improvements, so to speak, was this inspection element and the fact that we do not currently have an inspection standard. Now, for those of you who've been around for a long time, how many of you have been doing compliance monitoring for longer than 10 years? Can you raise your hands? Okay, how about longer than 15 years? Anyone? Okay, a handful. So those of you here in this last group, and maybe even the second group, may remember there was a time where OJJDP did require that you inspected all of your facilities at 100% every 3 years, right? But then we sort of backed off from that at some point, and we turned it into a recommendation. So since that point, there's not been any language in our manuals, even in the old guidance manual that was taken down, that said that we were requiring you to inspect your facilities at a given rate. So we really felt when the JJRA came out that this was an opening for us to address this issue, because really, while we trust that you are doing some inspecting, it would not be a good thing if you were only inspecting one facility every year, right? That does not really sound like even an adequate system of compliance monitoring, let alone an effective system of compliance monitoring. So this is where we really felt it was an area that was ripe for some change. The other thing that we discussed was, we all in our office do a lot of audits. I do a lot of compliance audits in particular. And one of the things that I've noticed when I go out and audit you all and talk with you all in your states that really has, quite frankly, impressed me is that even though we don't currently require you to inspect 100% of the secure facilities in your universe every year, there are an awful lot of you that are doing it anyway. You have taken this recommendation to heart, or maybe you just didn't get the memo 5 or 10 years ago that it wasn't a requirement anymore. But either way, there are a lot of you who are already doing this. So we said, hey, look, the vast majority of states are already there. So this should be an easy thing to implement. We know that the funding is down. You're not getting as much money as you were 10 years ago. But hey, if folks are already by and large doing this anyway, then this would be a great area for us to make some improvements to our system on paper, while also not substantially increasing the burden on you all at a time when funding is going down. So, again, historically, the recommendation has been that you inspect 33% of your secure facilities each year, with 100% of secure facilities receiving that inspection at least every 3 years. What we are looking at as an inspection standard for you all to achieve an effective system of monitoring would be beginning in October of 2021. That's going to be year 1 of the Title II's next 3-year planning cycle. So we are mid-3-year planning cycle right now, okay? So we're talking about year 1 of the coming 3-year planning cycle. OJJDP would require that you would inspect 100% of the secure facilities in your monitoring universe over that 3-year planning period. So it would not be just any 3-year period that you choose. It would have to be specifically over that 3-year planning cycle. So that would begin with the data that you are starting to collect on October 1st of 2021. That would be year 1. The data that you collect with the federal fiscal year starting 2022 would be year 2. The data that you collect beginning with the federal fiscal year 2023 would be year 3. And then at the end of that 3-year period, we're going to calculate how many facilities you inspected, looking back at all of your monitoring reports over that 3-year period, and see if you hit all of them, if you hit 100%. And that would be how we would determine whether or not you have met this particular standard towards achieving an effective system of compliance monitoring. So it's a little bit different than what I talked about a few minutes ago that was the old recommendation, because we're no longer saying that you have to do 33% a year. So if you want to do 10% in the first year and 10% in the second year and 80% in the third year, which I wouldn't recommend, but if that's what you really want to do, then you have met the standard, okay? What we would probably recommend would be more like the other way around, try to hit them more in the first 2 years, because you never know when something might happen in year 3. You have some staff turnover, you have a vacancy or something else comes up, someone who goes on medical leave, whatever, then you hopefully will have already inspected the majority in the first 2 years. But we're going to leave that up to you, okay? So you have 3 years in order to meet that standard under this particular proposal. So we want to hear from you about this. We want to hear what you guys think about this. So once again, there are some questions on your table. I believe, Lisa, is that right? They have them? Okay. So these questions that we are asking you to look at this time around are, we want to know, first of all, what is it that you like about OJJDP's proposed implementation of this provision? Hopefully there's something. If there is, that we want to hear about it. Number 2 is going to be, what concerns do you have? So if there's something that you really don't like about this proposal, we want to hear that as well. This is your opportunity to write that feedback down for us so that we can take it back to the office and study it further. And number 3, and I think, quite frankly, the most important question is, if you have concerns, how do you think that OJJDP could implement this provision in a way that would help to address them? Okay? So we obviously have to work within the bounds of the statute. We can't go back to Congress. Well, I guess we could, but it's not likely that there's going to be, this is going to change anytime soon. So we want to know, within the bounds of the statute, what is it that we could do to address any concerns that you might have? And if you think that there's something else that we're not doing that we haven't thought of, which is always very possible, then this is your opportunity to tell us about that now. What else do you think that we can or that we should be doing that perhaps we have not thought of around the implementation of this particular provision? So we're going to give you a few minutes to once again meet at your individual tables to discuss that. Please designate a note taker to write down the information, and then we will get back with you in a few minutes here, and we'll collect the information. I want to go ahead and start getting your ideas, because I already have been hearing from some of you, and I know you've come up with some good stuff that we haven't really thought about, so I want to make sure we have a chance to talk about this. So the first question: what do you like about OJJDP's proposed implementation of this provision? Anybody want to volunteer for that one? What do you like about this provision? Elimination of non-secure facilities, okay. That's a biggie. I heard about the elimination of non-secure facilities, but what about the inspection part? Anybody?
It gives you flexibility through scheduling of your inspections.
Okay, flexibility with scheduling. That's a good one. Anything else? Things that you think are good about this? Hopefully something. How about what I said before when I was up there presenting? I hope that you all agree that the majority of you, I believe, are already doing the 100% every 3 years. Is that fairly accurate?
Yes.
Okay. All right, good. I just wanted to make sure, because that's definitely the impression that I've got. Maybe, you might be a little bit shy of that 100%, but I think the vast majority of you are really there, which is a great thing. Okay. How about, what concerns do you have? Tell us what we have not thought about, because I know, excuse me, I know there are definitely a number of things probably that we have not thought about here that we need to. Back here.
So, yeah, the big question is, how do I identify, I don't need that, people don't give me microphones. How do I identify when a new facility opens or facilities go from non-secure to secure?
Okay.
And the other is, if you're short by one facility, that's the consequence.
Yeah, that's a really good one. If you're short by one facility, then what's the consequence? What if you've got all 600 facilities in your monitoring, or you got all 599 of the 600 facilities in your monitoring universe, but you missed one? Then does that mean that you're not going to get your money? I think that's a really, really good question, and this just came up a couple years ago, right, with the whole 85% data collection requirement that used to be 100% data collection requirement, right? So I think that's actually a really, really good point. Okay, what else? Tell me some more.
Mark from Montana. So Julie's already aware of this, but this is another thing that rural states, especially if they're larger states, Montana is the fourth biggest state in the United States, is the idea of not being required to monitor non-secure facilities anymore. And some states go, yay, that's great. But in all reality, for Montana, that doesn't work. Because if you have a little one-horse facility that's way out in the middle of nowhere where the jackrabbits pack canteens get so dry, we've decided to still monitor those facilities just mainly to keep them honest and make sure that, that they're doing things right. We require them to certify, but you get a new chief or sheriff in there, who knows if they're certifying correctly or not.
Sure.
And so we're going to do spot checks anyway, just to keep them going down the straight and narrow, and also to cover our heinies also. So, because we want to stay in compliance. So we're doing non-secures now, so we're going to continue to do them. So.
Yeah, and I think that's great, Mark. You're definitely not the first person that has told me that. It's an issue, right? We're not requiring you to have the non-secure facilities in your monitoring universe anymore, but we are still requiring you to make sure that you've identified all of the secure facilities. So if you're not monitoring the non-secures, then how do you know if they switched over to a secure facility, right? And maybe you've had one that switched and it's become secure, and so you didn't inspect it, and now you're one shy of meeting the 100% inspection requirement because you thought that facility was actually non-secure, but now it's secure, right? So yeah, I think that's a really, really good point. And actually, I just was emailing back and forth with another state not too long ago who was asking me a similar question. They said, well, we have these MOUs in place with some of our sister agencies, like our Department of Health and Human Services, around looking at their facilities that are under their purview and letting us tag along maybe on their site visits, or letting us know if any of those facilities flip and become secure, and should we just get rid of those MOUs? I'm not going to tell you have to keep them, but if it's easy to have an MOU, it's already there. All you got to do is renew it, and that keeps the lines of communication open, and they're still going to let you know if one of those facilities has changed. Then I say, I would continue to do it. I'm not sure I see a downside to that. But yeah, these are really good points. What else?
Scott from Iowa. Tying the 33% or 100% to the 3-year plan in those 3 years, I'm concerned that you'd get 33% the first year, 33% the third or second year, lose your staff in the third year, and only get 10% in.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. You really have to, no matter what, you really have to be careful, because there can always be something unexpected that comes up even in that third year. You think that you're on target, and again, like I said, you have staff turnover. You think you're all set, and your compliance monitor suddenly says, you know what, screw this job, I'm out of here. And I'm not even giving you your 2-week notice. And then we all know about state hiring practices, right, which are probably a lot like federal hiring practices. It's not like you can just hire somebody tomorrow to come in and take their spot, and then you got to train them, right? So definitely. What else?
This is Ellen in Alaska. And just kind of in relation to some of the percentage requirements discussion that I've heard, I personally would like to maybe challenge a little bit that an effective system of monitoring requires 100% of anything. I think you can be effective at 85%, 90%, and so I think one of our concerns was not having a margin built in on anything. Mm-hmm. If the standard is 100%, then the standard is a perfect system. So that was one of our concerns.
Very good point.
And we also had a lot of concerns raised about specific definitions and clarifying definitions, and how it sounds like within our table, we've gotten different guidance from different representatives at different times, and so just getting standard guidance and a standardized interpretation of definitions was a concern.
So when you say definitions of like, what are you thinking of specifically, Ellen?
So the ones that we specifically spoke about were correctional facility, lockup, and residential.
Okay, okay. All right, so some good points there too. I mean, again, we just had this conversation a few years ago about data collection standards. We initially said 100%. You guys said, hey, you guys are crazy. We can't collect data from all 100% of these facilities every single year. We said, well, you know, that's probably a really good point, and we said 85% instead. So should the same thing apply for inspection? Maybe it should. So I think that's a really good point.